From the soot-stained industrial ravines of Cleveland, Ohio, to the misty, isolated hills of Greenbrier County, West Virginia. From a lonely, windswept frontier tavern in Labette County, Kansas, to the modern, echoing trauma of a quiet suburban neighborhood in Vallejo, California. We will travel across the dark, historic landscape of Exeter, Rhode Island, descend into the terrifying, volatile valleys of Adams, Tennessee, and drift out to the treacherous, silent waters of Cape Hatteras, North Carolina. Finally, we will face the chilling biological mysteries of Flatwoods, West Virginia, walk the stone subterranean corridors of Louisville, Kentucky, and uncover a devastating industrial secret buried deep inside a mountain in Gauley Bridge, West Virginia. Each of these locations holds a dark piece of an unexplainable puzzle where human nature, clinical science, and the completely impossible collide. And if you'd like, leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from. Today, we look at 10 cases that defied the modern world, beginning with a legendary lawman who believed he had seen every shade of human depravity, until a clinical predator turned an entire American industrial city into a psychological chessboard. On a gray, biting afternoon in late September of 1935, two young boys were navigating the steep, muddy slopes of a desolate ravine in Cleveland, Ohio, looking for a shortcut away from the industrial smoke of the city. As they scrambled down into the area known as Kingsbury Run, their eyes caught a pale, irregular shape partially obscured by a patch of high, withered weeds. Expecting to find a discarded piece of local factory equipment or a stray animal carcass, they approached, only to freeze in a state of absolute, localized panic. Lying flat against the dark, damp earth was a human torso, cleanly severed at the waist and entirely stripped of its clothing. But it was not just the brutal nature of the separation that caused the local authorities to immediately lose their breath when they arrived at the scene. It was the clinical, terrifying state of the remains. There was no visible blood spatter on the surrounding foliage. There were no jagged tears, no signs of a frantic struggle, and no defensive markings. The flesh was pale, cold, and washed clean. Most disturbing of all, the victim's head had been removed with a single, flawless incision that demonstrated an absolute, undisturbed knowledge of human anatomy. It was as if a trained surgeon had performed a complex medical operation in a sterile theater, only to cast the results into a soot-filled industrial ditch. To understand how this horrific discovery shattered the psychological core of the region, one must look at the grim reality of Cleveland during the height of the Great Depression in the mid-1930s. The area known as Kingsbury Run was a dark, twisting valley of poverty, filled with thousands of transient laborers, drifters, and displaced families who had constructed temporary shantytowns out of scrap wood and rusted metal sheet. It was a lawless, invisible community where people arrived and vanished without a single official record ever being kept. Into this desperate landscape stepped Elliot Ness, a man who had already achieved legendary status across the United States as the fearless federal agent who brought down Al Capone's empire in Chicago. Appointed as Cleveland's new safety director, Ness was viewed as an untouchable, modern hero who would utilize cutting-edge forensic science and institutional reform to clean up the city's corrupt streets. He was organized, deeply analytical, and possessed an unshakable faith in the power of logical police work. He was accustomed to fighting traditional criminals, men driven by greed, power, and predictable human motives. He was entirely unprepared to hunt a phantom predator who did not care about money, left no witnesses, and viewed the human body as nothing more than raw material for a grotesque artistic display. Within months of the initial discovery, the crisis rapidly escalated into a full-scale public emergency. Additional body parts began manifesting across the city's drainage culverts and swampy riverbanks with a rhythmic, mechanical frequency. Each victim presented the exact same signature: clean decapitation, complete post-mortem exsanguination, and a post-mortem interval that suggested they had been kept alive in a secondary location for days before their ultimate execution. The local medical examiner, Dr. Samuel Gerber, noted during the subsequent autopsies that the cuts were not executed with traditional weapons like axes or cleavers. Instead, the killer was utilizing specialized surgical knives, cleanly separating the cervical vertebrae without chipping the bone structure. The investigation quickly became a nightmare of red herrings and systemic dead ends. Detectives launched massive, aggressive sweeps through the Kingsbury Run shantytowns, detaining hundreds of vagrants and drifters. Suspicion heavily shifted toward local slaughterhouse workers, eccentric independent butchers, and rogue medical students who possessed the anatomical knowledge required to handle human remains with such precision. One high-profile suspect, a local laborer named Frank Dolezal, was arrested under intense public scrutiny, but his contradictory timeline and the complete absence of physical evidence inside his home forced investigators to look elsewhere. The killer seemed to actively anticipate every move the police made, turning the investigation into a highly publicized humiliation for the department. The psychological warfare reached its peak when the predator began leaving targeted taunts directly within sight of Elliot Ness's municipal offices. In one instance, a pair of lower limbs was found wrapped neatly in cheap industrial burlap, placed precisely where the safety director would be forced to see the crime scene tape from his window. The local newspapers began running sensationalized, daily updates, openly questioning whether the famed lawman had met his match in the dark valley of the Cuyahoga River. The turning point arrived when Dr. Gerber completed a comprehensive forensic review of the 12 official victims. He discovered an unexplainable, terrifying pattern in the biological data. Every single decapitation had been performed while the victims were still technically breathing, yet their bodies showed zero baseline traces of adrenaline or standard physical trauma. They had been completely chemically paralyzed with an unknown compound that left their hearts beating just long enough for the predator to drain their blood supply entirely. Furthermore, spatial analysis of the cut marks proved that the killer was executing these complex dissections in a state of absolute, unlit darkness, relying entirely on an advanced sense of tactile memory. This realization effectively broke the police department's working theory. This was not the work of an uneducated drifter or an erratic butcher operating in a chaotic fit of rage. This was a highly disciplined, institutional intellectual who possessed unrestricted access to clinical paralyzing agents and a private, completely secure facility. Desperate to flush out the killer and cut off his hunting grounds, Elliot Ness made a controversial, high-stakes decision that would permanently define his career. In the dead of night, he mobilized a massive force of heavily armed police officers and ordered the complete, systematic burning of the Kingsbury Run shantytowns. Thousands of temporary structures were reduced to ash, and over 300 transient residents were permanently displaced from the valley. It was a brutal, visual display of state power intended to force the predator into the open. The tactic appeared to work, but not in the way Ness had envisioned. The horrific murders simply stopped. The dark entity that had haunted the industrial heart of Cleveland vanished into the ether, leaving behind an empty valley, an unsolved ledger of 12 mutilated citizens, and a deeply frustrated police department that could claim no official victory. Elliot Ness would eventually leave public service, his reputation heavily tarnished by his failure to secure a definitive arrest, and the case of the torso murderer was officially relegated to the cold case archives of history. But the true, unexplainable twist of the entire saga would not manifest until decades later, long after the principal investigators had passed away and the coal smoke of the 1930s had cleared from the American consciousness. During a routine cataloging of historical police correspondence and deep archival records, modern researchers uncovered a series of anonymous postcards that had been quietly delivered to investigators over a span of several years following the burning of the shantytowns. Each card contained an intricately hand-drawn map of the Ohio countryside, marked with precise geographical coordinates. When investigators cross-referenced these vintage maps with land surveys, they discovered that the coordinates pointed directly to the exact, undisturbed resting places of several missing victim heads that had never been recovered during the active run of the case. But it was the postmarks on the envelopes that caused a chill to run through the entire research team. Every single postcard had been processed and stamped from high-security, maximum confinement psychiatric institutions scattered across the United States. Modern forensic historians launched a meticulous investigation into the institutional records of those specific facilities, expecting to find a loose trail of a traveling patient who had been transferred between wards. Instead, they discovered an administrative reality that defied all conventional logic. Every single postcard had been dropped into the postal system on calendar dates when those specific psychiatric institutions were placed under absolute, documented medical lockdowns due to internal outbreaks of disease. During these periods, the facilities were completely isolated from the outside world. No patients were admitted, no transfers were permitted, and all outgoing inmate correspondence was systematically suspended and inspected by armed state guards. The inmates were physically incapable of reaching a mailbox. The terrifying implication suddenly inverted the entire geometry of the case. The individual who had spent years sending the precise coordinates of the human remains was not an inmate locked behind bars. It was someone who possessed a position of unchallenged institutional authority, a high-ranking physician or medical administrator who could walk freely through the locked heavy doors of America's asylums during a quarantine. The postcards were not a confession from a patient. They were a lifetime of silent taunts from a clinical professional who had used the absolute isolation of the state's own psychiatric system to construct a permanent, unassailable alibi, ensuring that the true identity of the monster of Kingsbury Run would remain safely hidden behind a white coat forever. The industrial valley of Cleveland, with its dark rivers and forgotten shantytowns, remains a monument to a time when a brilliant detective was completely outmaneuvered by a phantom who understood the human body all too well. But as the 1930s drew to a close, the dark focus of the unexplainable shifted away from the crowded urban centers of Ohio, traveling deep into the isolated wilderness of the American South, where a quiet community would soon discover that some secrets refused to remain buried, even when the laws of nature demand it. To understand how a community copes when the traditional boundaries of forensic science are completely shattered, we have to leave the dark asylum corridors of Ohio and travel back to the misty, densely forested ridges of late 19th century West Virginia. In the winter of 1897, the rural valleys of Greenbrier County operated under a strict, unwritten code of quiet observation. It was a landscape dominated by small, isolated farming communities where everyone knew their neighbor's ancestry, their daily routines, and their underlying eccentricities. Into this tightly knit world lived a young, exceptionally vibrant woman named Elva Zona Heister. Zona was known across the county for her high spirit, her quick wit, and her deep, unshakable devotion to her family. She spent her days navigating the rolling terrain of her family's homestead, an independent soul who seemed entirely content with the predictable, peaceful rhythms of rural life. But the baseline stability of the Heister household was permanently altered when a mysterious, charismatic outsider drifted into town. His name was Edward Shue, a towering, muscular blacksmith who had recently secured employment at a local shop. Edward possessed a calculated, smooth demeanor that quickly captivated the young woman, initiating a whirlwind, highly intense romance that completely blindsided Zona's relatives. Despite their deep, immediate connection, a heavy sense of localized dread began to form within the family unit, radiating primarily from Zona's mother, Mary Jane Heister. Mary Jane was a deeply intuitive, observant woman who possessed a sharp understanding of human nature. From the very first moment she was introduced to Edward Shue, an icy baseline of anxiety settled into her chest. She noticed a subtle, volatile undercurrent beneath his charming exterior, a rigid, controlling pattern of behavior that seemed to carefully isolate Zona from her lifelong friends. Edward was a man who fiercely guarded his past, offering vague, shifting timelines regarding his previous residences and family history, but Zona was utterly blinded by affection, entirely dismissive of her mother's maternal warnings. Within a matter of weeks, the pair traveled to a local magistrate and were officially wed, moving into a small, isolated two-story timber house tucked far back from the primary county road. To the casual observer, they appeared to be constructing a standard, prosperous life on the frontier. But behind the closed heavy doors of their remote home, a dark domestic dynamic was quietly unfolding, leaving small, invisible fractures in the young bride's spirit that only a mother's eye could truly detect. The fragile illusion of their quiet domestic life completely collapsed on a freezing afternoon in late January, just a few short months after the wedding. Edward Shue had dispatched a young neighborhood boy to the house on a routine errand, requesting that he check in on Zona to see if she required any supplies from the local market. When the child stepped across the threshold into the silent kitchen, he found the house entirely dark and eerily still. He called out Zona's name, receiving no response but the low whistling of the winter wind against the window panes. Navigating further into the property, the boy froze in absolute, localized panic. Lying flat against the hardwood floor at the foot of the staircase was Elva Zona Heister. Her body was completely motionless, stretched out in a rigid, unnatural alignment. The child fled the property in a state of sheer terror, alerting his parents and the town physician, Dr. George Knapp. But before the medical professional could even gather his diagnostic equipment and reach the remote homestead, an unusual and highly irregular sequence of events had already taken place inside the home. By the time Dr. Knapp stepped through the front door, Edward Shue had already returned to the scene, and his subsequent behavior immediately sent a wave of confusion through the responding community. Rather than leaving the physical space undisturbed for a standard medical review, Shue had already moved his wife's remains upstairs to the master bedroom. He had taken it upon himself to completely wash the body, dress it in a formal high-necked Sunday gown, and place a heavy, tightly knit scarf around her throat. As the doctor attempted to conduct a basic physical examination to determine the cause of death, Shue erupted into a state of intense, volatile aggression. He wept hysterically, cradling his wife's head in his massive arms and physically blocking Dr. Knapp from accessing her upper torso or neck. Every time the physician attempted to adjust the clothing or examine the cervical region for signs of external trauma, Shue became violently defensive, shouting that his grief was too immense to tolerate any further desecration of his wife's body. Faced with a highly intimidating, muscular blacksmith operating in a state of apparent psychological collapse, and noting no obvious signs of blood spatter or external wounds on her face, Dr. Knapp made a hurried, highly compromised medical assessment. He officially listed the cause of death as childbirth complications and general physical failure, closing his notebook and allowing the town to proceed with the burial. The true diagnostic breakdown began to manifest during the subsequent traditional wake held inside the crowded parlor of the Heaster family home. While the local citizens filed past the open casket to offer their baseline condolences, Edward Shue maintained a relentless, terrifyingly focused vigil at the head of the coffin. He had adorned Zona's neck with a large, rigid white collar, completely out of step with the traditional burial garments of the era, and placed a folded pillow on one side of her face. Whenever anyone attempted to adjust the fabric or look closer at the remains, Shue would aggressively step into their physical space, manipulating the veil and exhibiting a level of hypervigilance that made everyone in the room deeply uncomfortable. The community accepted the behavior as a tragic manifestation of an erratic, broken heart, but Mary Jane Heaster sat in the corner of the parlor, her eyes locked onto the high collar obscuring her daughter's skin. She knew, with an absolute, unshakable certainty, that a massive clinical deception was being executed directly in front of the entire township. When the burial process was completed and Zona was placed deep into the frozen mountain soil, Mary Jane removed a heavy yellow sheet that had been briefly placed inside the coffin. When she attempted to wash the fabric, she noted an unexplainable, bitter chemical odor and a dark, organic stain that refused to lift from the fibers, cementing her belief that her daughter had met a violent, unnatural end. Driven to absolute desperation by the local police department's refusal to reopen a closed medical file, Mary Jane turned to a power far removed from traditional investigative techniques. She began spending her nights in absolute isolation, kneeling on the hard timber floor of her bedroom, praying continuously for a precise, undeniable sign that would lay bare the truth. On the first night of her vigil, a sudden, unnatural drop in room temperature caused her breath to crystallize in the air. Looking up into the darkness, she witnessed a pale, luminous manifestation materialize near the doorway. It was the distinct spirit of Elva Zona Heaster. Unlike a traditional, chaotic phantom designed to inflict terror, the apparition spoke in a chillingly calm, melodic voice. Over the course of 4 consecutive nights, the manifestation returned, methodically mapping out the timeline of her final hours. She explained that Edward Shue had returned to the isolated cabin in a state of explosive, irrational fury triggered by a trivial domestic dispute over a poorly prepared evening meal. The confrontation had rapidly escalated into severe physical trauma, culminating in Shue using his immense blacksmith strength to violently overpower her. To ensure her mother understood the precise mechanics of the crime, the spectral figure reached up with both hands and physically rotated her own head completely backward, demonstrating a catastrophic internal separation of the spine. Armed with this terrifying, highly specific intelligence, Mary Jane traveled to the nearby town of Lewisburg to meet with the local prosecuting attorney, John Alfred Preston. Preston was a highly educated, analytical legal professional who possessed an intense respect for evidence, logic, and the established rules of the court. When an elderly rural woman sat across from his desk and began describing a detailed murder plot delivered via a 4-night spectral manifestation, Preston's immediate instinct was to dismiss the claim as a tragic, grief-induced psychological delusion. But as a seasoned investigator, he began to analyze the underlying patterns of her testimony, He noted that Mary Jane was not describing vague feelings of malice. She was providing a highly structured, sequence-driven account of a physical altercation. Intrigued by the illogical gaps in the original medical report, Preston began conducting discreet interviews with the townspeople who had attended the wake. He learned of Edward Shue's aggressive interference during Dr. Knapp's initial evaluation, his absolute refusal to allow anyone to touch the neck area, and his erratic behavior at the cemetery. Recognizing that a profound forensic error had likely been committed due to intimidation, Preston utilized his administrative authority to bypass the initial death certificate, ordering an official, comprehensive exhumation of the body. The subsequent legal procedure was executed inside a local schoolhouse, transformed temporarily into a sterile medical theater. A prominent three-doctor panel, including Dr. Knapp, gathered around the exhumed casket in front of a quiet, deeply tense crowd of local officials. When the medical team systematically unbuttoned the high-necked gown and removed the rigid white collar, the initial hypothesis of a natural medical decline completely disintegrated. The autopsy results revealed extensive, localized deep tissue trauma that had been entirely invisible to the naked eye during the initial hurried review. The skin of the throat exhibited precise manual pressure marks consistent with a violent strangulation event. But it was the structural analysis of the skeletal frame that left the entire room completely silent. The first and second cervical vertebrae, specifically the atlas and the axis, had been fractured and separated entirely from the spinal column. The windpipe had been completely crushed beneath the weight of an immense physical force. The true, mind-bending twist of the investigation was laid bare. Mary Jane Heister, an uneducated rural woman with absolutely zero training in orthopedic medicine, structural anatomy, or forensic pathomechanics, had flawlessly and with absolute accuracy described a complex, invisible internal fracture before the soil of the grave had ever been broken. Her description of her daughter's neck being broken at the first joint was an exact clinical match for the secret forensic truth hidden beneath the timber casket. The legal trial of Edward Shue rapidly transformed into a nationwide media sensation, drawing hundreds of spectators to the Greenbrier County Courthouse. The prosecution, led by John Preston, methodically laid out the hard physical reality of the autopsy results, matching the fracture patterns to the physical capability of a professional blacksmith. In a desperate, highly calculated defensive strategy, Shue's legal counsel attempted to completely destroy the credibility of the state's star witness. They forced Mary Jane Heister to take the stand, subjecting her to a relentless, highly aggressive cross-examination regarding her supernatural encounters. The defense expected the elderly woman to dissolve into hysterics, calculation that the conservative, logical jury would immediately reject the entire case if it was rooted in a ghost story. But Mary Jane remained completely unshakable. She recounted the 4 nights of manifestations with a casual, clinical precision that left no room for doubt, staring directly at Edward Shue as she spoke. The jury deliberated for a matter of hours, entirely convinced by the perfect mathematical alignment between the mother's impossible testimony and the rigid forensic data. Shue was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to a lifetime term of hard labor inside the West Virginia State Penitentiary, where he would eventually perish from an outbreak of disease a few years later. The case of the Greenbrier ghost remains a unique, unassailable anomaly within the history of American jurisprudence, the only documented instance where the testimony of a phantom spirit was effectively entered into a court of law to secure a conviction against a clinical predator. It proved to a skeptical modern world that some secrets possess a baseline frequency that can bridge the divide between life and death to demand absolute justice. But, as the 1900s approached, the focus of the unexplainable shifted from the haunted ridges of West Virginia to a lonely, windswept trail on the lawless Kansas frontier, where an unassuming family would soon demonstrate that a polite welcome can mask a profound and terrifying hunger for human life. To understand the absolute breakdown of logic that occurred on the American frontier in the late 19th century, we have to travel back to the vast, windswept prairies of Labette County, Kansas. In 1871, the region known as the Osage Township was a lonely, hazardous landscape transitioning from an untamed territory into a structured civil society. For homesteaders moving west along the Great Osage Trail, survival depended entirely on baseline self-reliance and the rare outposts of hospitality scattered across the open plains. Into this isolated territory arrived a family of 4 spiritual outliers who called themselves the Benders. The household consisted of John Sr., a silent, deeply imposing man with a weather-beaten face, his highly volatile wife, Elvira, their charismatically strange son, John Jr., and their exceptionally expressive daughter, Kate. Together, they constructed a modest, single-room timber cabin directly adjacent to the primary state highway. To the casual observer, they appeared to be industrious pioneers, establishing a vital roadside general store and inn where traveling merchants could purchase hot meals, rest their horses, and secure basic dry goods for their hazardous westward transit. The Benders carefully cultivated an atmosphere of simple frontier domesticity, dividing their small cabin down the center with a heavy, thick canvas cloth partition. The front section operated as a public dining room and grocery, while the concealed rear area served as the family's private living quarters. But it was the unique, magnetic personality of 23-year-old Kate Bender that rapidly turned the remote cabin into a prominent regional hub. Kate openly marketed herself as a powerful psychic medium, a spiritual healer who possessed an advanced capability to communicate with the deceased. In an era deeply traumatized by the loss of life from recent military conflicts, her alleged supernatural gifts drew dozens of wealthy, grieving travelers from the trail. They would sit inside the small parlor for hours, paying premium financial rates to witness Kate enter a trance-like state and speak in shifting, overlapping voices. The local community accepted the family as eccentric but necessary pillars of the highway system, completely blind to the calculating, predatory operational logic that was quietly unfolding behind that heavy canvas sheet. The fragile baseline of peace in the township began to dissolve in the spring of 1873, when a highly disturbing pattern of missing persons reports began to burden the local authorities. Travelers of substantial financial means would leave prominent settlements in eastern Kansas, heading west toward the frontier, only to vanish entirely from the historical record without a single trace. Because the plains were still heavily populated by desperate horse thieves, violent highwaymen, and territorial outlaws, early police reasoning automatically attributed the disappearances to standard frontier lawlessness. But the entire investigative landscape completely transformed when the target shifted to a prominent local physician named Dr. William York. Dr. York had set out from his home near Fort Scott on a routine journey, maintaining a predictable, well-documented timeline. When he failed to arrive at his final destination, his family immediately recognized that a catastrophic intervention had taken place. His disappearance triggered an unprecedented crisis because his biological brother was Colonel Edward York, a highly decorated military commander possessing massive political influence and an unyielding commitment to logistical order. Colonel York refused to allow his brother's disappearance to be relegated to a standard missing persons file. Utilizing his military authority, he organized a massive, heavily armed civil search party and began systematically tracing Dr. York's final known coordinates along the Great Osage Trail. In May of 1873, the colonel's investigation brought him directly to the threshold of the Bender homestead. The family welcomed the military official with complete, performed empathy. John Jr. and Kate listened intently as the colonel described his brother's physical appearance and horse team, casually admitting that the doctor had indeed stopped at their inn for a warm evening meal before continuing his journey into the Western Territories. Shu and his sister even offered to accompany the search party into the surrounding valleys, calculating that a display of open cooperation would completely deflect any localized suspicion. But as Colonel York sat inside the cabin, his seasoned analytical eye caught a minor structural detail that did not align with a standard pioneer household. He noticed that the wooden floorboards directly beneath the primary dining table were completely clean, yet the surrounding baseline timber showed a natural accumulation of frontier dust and mud. Though he chose not to press the issue immediately, a cold sense of tactical caution caused him to establish a continuous surveillance detail on the property. The final investigative breakthrough occurred a few weeks later, when local independent neighbors noticed an unusual, absolute silence descending over the Bender farmstead. The family's livestock had been left entirely unattended, crying out from starvation in the midday heat, and the front door of the timber cabin was hanging slightly open, swinging rhythmically in the prairie wind. Sensing a profound tactical shift, a large posse of armed citizens and township officials rushed the property. Entering the abandoned structure with their weapons drawn, the family had vanished entirely under the cover of a massive midnight rainstorm. As the search party began a meticulous structural evaluation of the empty house, a wave of pure biological decay suddenly radiated from beneath their boots. Investigators migrated toward the primary dining area, clearing away the heavy table and lifting a concealed wooden trapdoor built flat into the floor structure. Peering down into the absolute darkness, they discovered a hand-dug storage cellar drenched in dried organic residue, with the damp clay walls retaining a heavy, unmistakable metallic odor that indicated massive, repeated blood loss had occurred within the confined subterranean vault. Driven to a state of collective fury, the search party mobilized massive excavation tools and shifted their focus to the adjacent young apple orchard. Over the course of several exhausting days, local doctors and forensic volunteers systematically exhumed the orchard soil, uncovering the remains of Dr. William York and at least 10 other missing travelers, including a young girl whose body had been buried directly beneath her father's skeletal structure. The true horror of the scene lay in the absolute uniform nature of the physical trauma. The attending township physicians conducted a rigorous baseline analysis of the craniums, documenting that every single victim presented identical, massive blunt force trauma to the posterior region of the skull. The bone had been completely pulverized by a single, highly focused downward blow, executed with an instrument possessing the exact surface area of a heavy blacksmith sledgehammer. Furthermore, the anterior neck structures of each skeleton exhibited deep, precise cuts that had completely severed the jugular veins post-mortem. This was not the work of horse thieves operating in a chaotic, defensive skirmish on the open trail. This was a highly disciplined, assembly line execution apparatus designed to extract maximum financial wealth with absolute assembly line efficiency. The investigation soon allowed the local detectives to completely reconstruct the terrifying spatial logic of the Bender trap. When a wealthy traveler arrived at the general store, the family would utilize Kate's spiritual charisma to entice them into staying for an evening meal. The guest would be deliberately guided to the seat of honor at the dining table, which was positioned directly flat against the thick canvas partition sheet. While the traveler engaged in casual conversation with Kate or Elvira, one of the Bender men, either John Sr. or John Jr., would quietly position themselves directly behind the canvas divider in absolute darkness, balancing a massive iron sledgehammer. At a precise psychological cue, the hammer would be driven through the fabric sheet, inflicting instant, catastrophic blunt force trauma to the back of the guest's head. The body would then be immediately dragged behind the curtain, where the women would execute the final post-mortem cuts before releasing the trapdoor and sliding the remains into the blood-drenched cellar below, leaving the dining space perfectly clear for the next unsuspecting customer. But the true, unexplainable twist that permanently elevated the case into the realm of historical anomalies was discovered inside a hollow structural timber beam near the cabin's roofline. Hidden deep within the framework was a personal leather-bound notebook that operated as the family's internal operational ledger. As investigators carefully turned the weathered parchment pages, expecting to find a standard accounting of stolen pocket watches, currency, and horse teams, they confronted an administrative reality that completely defied the established linear timeline of the crimes. The ledger did indeed contain a meticulous, chronological log of names, dates, and the precise financial valuation of the victims' extracted belongings. But as regional authorities began cross-referencing the written data with federal census records, they discovered a series of entries that made no logical sense. Spanned across the final pages of the journal were the complete names and exact physical descriptions of several prominent individuals who were verified to still be alive and residing in neighboring states, men who had never even set foot in Labette County. Most terrifying of all, the ledger contained a detailed post-mortem tracking of at least 3 local children who were officially documented to have been born years after the Benders had permanently abandoned the cabin and vanished from the state. The ink on the paper was years older than the biological lives of the individuals it recorded. The revelation plunged the frontier community into an enduring state of psychological paranoia. A massive, multi-state manhunt was immediately initiated by federal marshals, private detective agencies, and heavily armed vigilante groups, all desperate to secure the bounty on the missing family. Rumors quickly flooded the territory, with some claiming the Benders had been overtaken by a private posse and executed without a trial, while others insisted they had successfully slipped onto a westbound train under assumed identities, scattering into the vast urban centers of the Pacific Coast. Despite dozens of high-profile arrests and false identifications spanning over 3 decades, not a single member of the Bender household was ever officially brought to a court of justice. Their true identities, their ultimate destination, and the impossible, prophetic nature of their dark administrative ledger remained permanently lost to the history of the Kansas Plains. The lonely timber cabin in Labette County was eventually dismantled by relic hunters piece by piece, leaving behind nothing but an empty, scarred rectangle of earth surrounded by a withered orchard. But as the frontier attempts to pave over the memories of the sledgehammer murders, the dark trajectory of the unexplainable travels far away from the open prairies of the Midwest, migrating toward the modern, sun-drenched coastal neighborhoods of Northern California, where a brilliant young professional couple would soon find themselves trapped within a highly sophisticated mechanical nightmare that turned the entire apparatus of American law enforcement completely upside down. To understand how an entire family can be systematically erased from a community without leaving a single trace of physical data, we have to travel back to the cold, snow-covered ridges of West Virginia during the winter of 1945. Nestled within the Appalachian landscape, the small town of Fayetteville operated as a quiet industrial hub where families built their lives around traditional hard labor, close-knit immigrant communities and the predictable routines of rural life. Into this baseline setting lived George and Jenny Sauter, a highly respected and prosperous couple who had constructed an absolute monument to the American dream. George had immigrated to the United States from Sardinia as a young man, starting with nothing before building a highly successful trucking and timber haulage company. He was disciplined, fiercely independent, and deeply analytical. Together with his wife Jenny, he managed a large, beautiful 2-story timber frame home just outside the town limits, raising 10 children in an environment filled with warmth and modern comforts. But beneath the surface of their comfortable domestic success, a silent, volatile tension was beginning to form within the local landscape, rooted entirely in George's outspoken political convictions. George Sauter possessed an intense, unyielding hatred for the Italian dictator Benito Mussolini, and he refused to hide his views, frequently engaging in explosive public debates with other local immigrant families who still harbored deep loyalties to the old regime. This vocal independence created a dangerous, localized friction that rapidly escalated in the months leading up to the winter holidays. In October of 1945, a traveling life insurance salesman entered George's office, attempting to secure a premium policy. When George flatly declined the offer, the salesman's demeanor instantly broke into a state of intense aggression. He pointed directly at George's home and shouted a terrifying, specific prophecy, stating that the house would be reduced to smoke and that his children would be completely destroyed as direct payment for his dirty remarks against Mussolini. Weeks later, another strange man appeared on the property under the guise of seeking work, looking at the structural fuse boxes and casually warning George that a catastrophic electrical fire was guaranteed to manifest within the framework, despite the fact that George had just had the entire electrical system certified and verified by a professional utility engineer. The family dismissed the incidents as erratic expressions of local malice, completely blind to the fact that their daily habits were being methodically tracked from the darkness of the state highway. The timeline of tragedy officially initiated its run on the late evening of Christmas Eve. The household was filled with holiday celebrations, and around midnight, Jenny retired to the master bedroom with the youngest children, leaving the older siblings to finish their baseline routines and play with their new toys before turning off the lights. At precisely 12:30 in the morning, the sharp, mechanical ringing of the telephone shattered the absolute silence of the house. Jenny woke up, descended the stairs, and lifted the receiver, only to confront a highly unsettling auditory environment. A strange woman's voice asked for a completely unfamiliar name, accompanied by the distinct background sounds of clinking glasses, manic laughter, and a cold, unfamiliar baseline energy. When Jenny politely informed the caller they had dialed the wrong number, the woman let out a low, chilling laugh and terminated the connection. Attempting to clear the anxiety from her mind, Jenny looked around the lower level and noted a series of unusual structural disruptions. The downstairs lights were still completely turned on, the heavy privacy curtains had been left wide open, and the front door was entirely unlocked. She systematically corrected the anomalies, assumed the older children had simply been careless in their exhaustion, and returned to her bed. At exactly 1 in the morning, a heavy, sharp thud echoed from the roof directly above Jenny's head, followed by a distinct rolling sound that migrated down the timber shingles before dropping into the frozen grass below. She listened intently for several long minutes, but when the absolute silence of the Appalachian night returned, she allowed herself to drift back into a light sleep. At 1:30, a dense, suffocating wave of smoke cut through the master bedroom, triggering an immediate state of life-or-death panic. Jenny screamed for George, and together they began a frantic evacuation of the burning structure. They managed to pull 4 of the youngest children through the blinding black cloud and exit into the freezing winter air. But when George looked back at the frame house, his heart completely stopped. The entire lower level was already engulfed in a violent, accelerating inferno, and the interior staircase leading to the upper attic rooms where the other 5 children were sleeping, Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty, was completely blocked by an absolute wall of fire. George Sauter refused to accept the physical limitations of the scene, immediately moving into a state of tactical rescue execution. He ran to the side of the house to retrieve his tall wooden extension ladder, which had rested securely in the exact same spot against the frame for multiple years. It was completely gone, leaving an empty imprint in the snow. Desperate, he sprinted toward his 2 massive commercial utility trucks parked near the driveway, planning to park them against the structure and climb onto the heavy roofs to smash through the attic windows. Both vehicles, which had been operating with absolute mechanical perfection just hours earlier, refused to turn over. The starter motors clicked rhythmically, but the engines were completely dead, as if the fuel lines had been intentionally compromised. He ran to the large rain barrels to douse the ascending flames, only to find the water had frozen solid into dense blocks of ice. The telephone lines inside the house were completely non-functional. A neighbor ran to a nearby commercial store to contact emergency services, but the local operator failed to respond to the baseline signal. Another citizen was forced to physically mount a vehicle and drive directly into the center of town to track down Fire Chief Fletcher Morris. By the time the department's single engine finally rolled onto the property at 8 in the morning, the Sauter home had been reduced to a flat, smoldering rectangle of charcoal. The entire structural framework had collapsed into the basement vault in just 45 minutes. The community gathered around the perimeter of the ash, preparing themselves for the somber forensic task of recovering the remains of the 5 missing children. Chief Morris conducted a brief, highly superficial survey of the smoldering debris and immediately closed the ledger, declaring that the children had perished within the initial acceleration of the fire. He claimed that the extreme, concentrated intensity of the blaze had completely cremated and vaporized their young bone structures into thin air, leaving behind 0 physical data. The local county coroner quickly issued official death certificates listing faulty wiring as the baseline cause of the fire. But as the initial shock of the tragedy began to transition into cold, logical analysis, George and Jenny uncovered structural and physical anomalies that completely destroyed the official administrative narrative. A local line mechanic climbed the primary utility pole near the road and discovered that the telephone wires had not been melted through by the thermal output of the blaze. They had been cleanly, deliberately severed with professional, high-leverage wire cutters at the very top of the harness. Furthermore, the missing wooden extension ladder was located hidden deep within a steep roadside embankment 75 feet away from the property line. Witnesses from the surrounding valley began stepping forward, introducing terrifying new details into the investigative record. A local motorist reported seeing a strange man stealing a heavy block and tackle from George's utility trucks during the exact window when the fire was initiating its run. Most disturbing of all, a bus driver passing through Fayetteville around midnight reported seeing a group of unidentified individuals throwing small, glowing fireballs onto the roof of the Sauter home, matching the exact timeline of the heavy thud Jenny had experienced. Rumors began to saturate the county, placing the children at a local diner hours after the fire, or suggesting they had been secured inside a passing vehicle headed toward the state border. State detectives and local police chased a succession of high-profile red herrings, aggressively pursuing lines of inquiry that focused on interstate multi-car theft rings, transient highway drifters, and even a localized kidnapping syndicate operating out of the commercial shipping lanes. But every single track eventually dissolved into a bureaucratic dead end, leaving the parents to face a stone wall of institutional silence. The true turning point of the entire saga manifested when independent fire safety professionals, veteran arson investigators, and credentialed skeletal pathologists conducted a comprehensive, scientific review of the thermal timeline. They presented a clinical baseline that completely shattered the local fire department's conclusions. A standard residential structure fire, fueled by seasoned timber framework and common household furnishings, simply lacks the physical and chemical capacity to completely cremate human bone structure in 45 minutes. In a modern commercial crematorium, specialized retorts must sustain temperatures exceeding 1500 degrees Fahrenheit for multiple hours under highly focused, pressurized conditions to break down adolescent skeletal frames, and even then, dense fragments and dental structures remain entirely intact. The complete, absolute absence of any baseline organic residue, teeth, or microfragments within the Fayetteville basement vault proved a physical impossibility. The children had not burned within the house. The fire was not a spontaneous electrical tragedy. It was a highly calculated tactical cover-up designed to obscure a rapid extraction event. With this realization, the entire geometry of the mystery completely inverted, forcing the family to reenact the true sequence of events from a terrifying new psychological angle. The strange late-night telephone call was not a random wrong number, it was a baseline proximity check executed by the extraction team to verify if the parents were asleep or distracted. The man tracking the property from the highway was an operational scout, mapping the exact layout of the upstairs windows and securing the removal of the rescue equipment. The object that struck the roof at 1 a.m. was an industrial chemical incendiary device thrown onto the timber shingles to ensure a rapid, uncontrollable structural collapse that would completely trap George and Jenny within a localized panic, preventing them from witnessing the children being systematically removed from the rear of the property before the flames ever reached the upper level. The extraction was politically motivated, executed by a highly disciplined network designed to punish George for his vocal noncompliance. The ultimate mind-bending confirmation of this extraction theory arrived 20 years later in 1965. Jenny Sauter was sorting through the Morning Post when she uncovered an unpostmarked envelope delivered from Kentucky. Inside was a clean, modern photograph of a young adult male with dark hair and piercing eyes, bearing an identical, undeniable facial architecture and bone structure to their missing son, Louis. Written across the reverse side of the image in steady, precise ink was a cryptic, haunting phrase. Louis Sauter, I love brother Frankie, Lilu boys, a 90132. The family immediately engaged private intelligence agents to sweep through the state of Kentucky, attempting to track down the physical origin of the photograph and decode the final alphanumeric string. But the sequence, a 90132, yielded absolutely zero matches within any military, tax, or civil governmental database. It was a completely ghost-like sequence, a phantom marker left by an invisible network. George and Jenny transformed the remaining years of their lives into a permanent, frozen monument to the investigation. They cleared the black charcoal from the property, packing the basement vault with fresh soil, and erected a massive, iconic billboard along Route 16. The sign displayed the vintage faces of the 5 children, offering a massive financial reward to anyone who could pull back the curtain on the extraction team. Jenny wore garments of absolute black mourning for the rest of her natural life, tending to the flowers around the billboard until her death, passing away without ever learning where her stolen children had been taken. The smoldering rectangle of earth in Fayetteville remains an open, haunting question mark in the annals of American missing persons cases. The empty space where the Sauter home once stood serves as a cold reminder that a bright holiday night can be shattered in a single moment by an unseen force that operates far outside the boundaries of normal human law. But as the mid-20th century attempts to pave over the secrets of the West Virginia ridges, the dark focus of the unexplainable travels back into the historical past, migrating toward a bleak, 19th century New England village consumed by the terrors of folklore, where a desperate community would soon turn to the dead to save the living, only to uncover a terrifying biological anomaly beneath the winter soil. To understand how an entire rural community can completely abandon modern scientific reason and succumb to a collective dark psychological delusion, we have to travel back to the frozen, wind-swept hills of late 19th century New England. In the early months of 1892, the isolated farming community of Exeter, Rhode Island, operated under a constant, baseline state of environmental dread. It was a bleak, unforgiving landscape where the winter ground remained locked in thick sheets of ice for months at a time, and the local citizens lived in deep physical isolation from the rapidly industrializing coastal cities. The community was currently under an intense, invisible siege by a slow, relentless predator known colloquially to the townspeople as the White Plague, or consumption, but recognized by modern medical history as tuberculosis. It was a devastating, wasting illness that systematically hollowed out the lungs of its victims, causing them to slowly fade away over the course of multiple years. Into this stark setting lived George Brown, a stoic, hard-working, independent landowner who had spent his entire life cultivating a modest farmstead along the rocky perimeter of the township. George was a man of quiet discipline, highly respected by his neighbors for his baseline resilience, but his domestic stability was about to be permanently shattered by an unexplainable string of family tragedies. The structural breakdown of the Brown household initiated its run over a decade earlier when George's beloved wife Mary suddenly developed the unmistakable, terrifying signature symptoms of the wasting disease, the chronic hacking cough, the extreme physical emaciation, and the pale, pallid skin tone that turned translucent in the morning light. Within a matter of months, her respiratory system completely failed, leaving George to raise their young children in absolute isolation. The localized trauma intensified a few years later when their eldest daughter, Mary Olive, a vibrant and deeply empathetic young woman, began presenting the identical clinical baseline. She too was buried within the family plot before the year concluded. For a brief window, a fragile baseline of peace returned to the homestead, allowing George's remaining children to reach adulthood. But in the winter of 1891, the dark pattern manifested once more, focusing its volatile energy on their 19-year-old daughter, Mercy Lena Brown. Mercy was known across the county for her high spirit and exceptional vitality, but the aggressive nature of the infection rapidly overwhelmed her system, and she passed away in the dead of January, during a historic freeze that left the cemetery soil as hard as solid granite. The psychological core of the community completely ruptured when George's only surviving son, Edwin, a promising young clerk who was viewed as the sole beneficiary of the family estate, began exhibiting the initial, terrifying indications of the exact same pulmonary decline. Edwin's physical deterioration was exceptionally rapid. He was frequently confined to his bed, gasping for shallow pockets of air while his chest emitted a low, wet rattling sound that's signaling a terminal medical outcome. Driven to absolute desperation by the complete failure of traditional 19th century medical treatments, the citizens of Exeter began to turn away from clinical logic, choosing instead to resurrect a dark, ancestral folklore that had slumbered within the hidden valleys of New England for generations. A collective conviction began to saturate the township. The townspeople became firmly convinced that the White Plague was not a biological contagion, but a malevolent, vampiric extraction event. They believed that one of the recently deceased Brown women was actively rising from her grave under the cover of absolute darkness, physically draining the remaining vitality from Edwin's bone marrow through an invisible, spiritual umbilical cord tied directly to the family plot. On a biting gray morning in March of 1892, a large contingent of prominent town elders, accompanied by a deeply reluctant local physician named Dr. Harold Metcalf, arrived at the pristine snowline of the Exeter Cemetery. Their explicit investigative objective was to exhume the bodies of the deceased family members to search for a definitive physical sign of the supernatural curse. George Brown, entirely broken by a decade of unrelenting grief and desperate to secure any potential medical salvation for his dying son, stood silently by, allowing the men to systematically break through the frozen soil. The excavation team first raised the caskets of the mother, Mary, and the eldest sister, Mary Olive. When Dr. Metcalf conducted a basic structural evaluation of the remains, he noted a completely standard advanced process of natural skeletal decomposition, ruling them out of the anomalous investigation. But when the laborers cleared the heavy clay from the shallow timber coffin of 19-year-old Mercy Lena Brown, the entire assembly immediately lost their breath in a state of absolute, localized panic. When the wooden lid was lifted away, the physical configuration of the remains defied every established expectation of the townspeople. Mercy's body was completely, entirely untouched by the hand of natural decay. Her face was full, her skin was pristine and flushed with an unexplainable, lifelike rose color, and her body had mysteriously shifted onto its side within the tight confines of the coffin. Most disturbing of all to the watching crowd, her hair and nails appeared to have actively grown in length since her winter burial. Dr. Metcalf stepped forward to execute a rigorous clinical evaluation, utilizing a silver scalpel to perform a precise anatomical incision into her thoracic cavity. When the blade pierced the muscle tissue of her heart and liver, a significant volume of fresh, liquid human blood immediately pooled into the opening, completely uncoagulated and vibrant in color. To the terrified, superstitious villagers, this was the absolute, undeniable verification of the vampiric hypothesis. They believed they were looking at a living monster that was actively harvesting Edwin's blood from beneath the soil. Driven by a wave of collective hysteria, the elders executed a horrific traditional ritual. They completely extracted Mercy's heart from her chest plate, placed it flat upon a nearby stone surface, and burned it to a dark ash over a wood fire, later dissolving the charred biological residue into a liquid medicinal tonic that they forced the bedridden Edwin to completely consume as an ultimate cure. The local police authorities and independent state investigators quickly launched a thorough review of the incident, attempting to untangle the bizarre baseline logic that had led an entire Christian community to perform a pagan dissection in a public cemetery. The early investigation heavily targeted the role of regional red herrings, with detectives aggressively pursuing lines of inquiry that focused on independent religious sects, traveling herbalist fraudsters, and hidden eccentric occult practitioners who might have manipulated the family's grief to secure a financial payout. The local newspapers ran highly critical, sensationalized articles, openly mocking the residents of Exeter as backward, uneducated primitives who were entirely out of step with the modern, scientific realities of the late 19th century. Dr. Metcalf issued a formal, detailed public statement to the Regional Medical Board, attempting to stabilize his professional reputation. He provided a clear, logical, scientific thesis for Mercy's pristine condition, explaining that because she had been buried in the absolute dead of a New England winter within a shallow, frozen earth shelf, the extreme thermal parameters had essentially acted as a natural institutional refrigerator. The cold had completely arrested the standard process of bacterial decay, preserving her blood in a liquid state, while the natural drying and contraction of the skin tissue had merely created the optical illusion of hair and nail growth. But the entire geometry of the case completely inverted when Edwin Brown passed away in a state of severe respiratory collapse just 24 hours after consuming the ritualistic ash tonic. The sudden, violent nature of his death completely destroyed the town's folklore hypothesis, forcing the regional legal authorities to step in. Fearing either a hidden criminal poisoning event executed by the villagers or a catastrophic public health contamination event stemming from the handling of the exhumed remains, the state ordered a formal, comprehensive judicial autopsy to be conducted on the young clerk. A veteran pathologist from a prominent metropolitan district was brought into the county clinic to perform an absolute, undisturbed evaluation of Edwin's internal organ systems, completely removed from the influence of local superstition. When the state pathologist reflected the chest plate and accessed Edwin's pulmonary architecture, he confronted a physical reality that made absolutely no logical sense within the established parameters of 19th century pathology. The true, mind-bending twist of the entire investigation was officially entered into the state's permanent legal record. The young man's lungs did not exhibit the traditional advanced cavities, widespread bacterial rot, or classic fluid accumulation typical of a terminal consumption patient. Instead, Edwin's entire upper respiratory tract and both primary lung fields were completely packed, compressed, and physically choked by thousands of dense strands of fresh, entirely undecomposed human tissue. When the state laboratory executed a rigorous microscopic evaluation and baseline blood clustering analysis on this invasive flesh, they discovered an impossible biological truth. The living tissue inside Edwin's lungs was a flawless genetic match for his deceased sister, Mercy Lena Brown, sharing her exact, exceptionally rare blood type and cellular matrix. The pathologist was eventually able to completely reconstruct the terrifying, anomalous sequence of events from a cold biomechanical angle, proving that the previous details had merely been viewed from the wrong psychological perspective. Mercy Brown had not been a passive corpse frozen by the winter ground. She had been the primary carrier of an exceptionally rare, hyper-aggressive cellular mutation that allowed her cardiovascular tissue to maintain a baseline state of suspended animation surviving independent of central nervous system function within the specialized conditions of the frozen soil. When the villagers had surgically extracted her heart and subjected it to the low-temperature wood fire, the thermal output of the flames had completely failed to incinerate the robust cellular matrices. Instead, the heat had merely dehydrated the tissue, transforming the living mutated cells into a highly resilient, microscopic, airborne particulate matter. When the fluid tonic was administered to Edwin, his already compromised raw respiratory linings had actively absorbed the char dust. Rather than digesting the material, his lungs had acted as a perfect, warm incubator. The living cellular strands of his sister had literally taken root within his thoracic architecture, aggressively generating new tissue that physically cloned her heart cells inside his chest cavity, creating an absolute mechanical obstruction that slowly and completely suffocated him from the inside out. The folklore had not invented the monster. The community had inadvertently manufactured a biological nightmare through their own desperate intervention. The grave of Mercy Lena Brown stands to this day within the quiet perimeter of the Chestnut Hill Cemetery in Exeter, Rhode Island. To prevent any further physical desecration or anomalous exhumations, local historians and descendants eventually encased her original headstone within a thick, heavy band of reinforced structural iron, anchoring it deep into the earth with massive metal stakes. It remains archived within the permanent repositories of American folklore and early medical history as the absolute final recorded instance of a vampire panic on American soil, a cold reminder of a dark winter night when clinical. Reality proved far more terrifying than any supernatural myth. But as the 20th century attempts to pave over the memories of the Rhode Island exhumation, the dark focus of the unexplainable travels back into the early history of the American frontier, migrating toward a prosperous early 19th century homestead in Adams, Tennessee, where a wealthy family would find themselves targeted by a deeply malevolent, highly articulate, invisible force that possessed an impossible knowledge of the future. The transition from the frozen, preserved winter ground of Exeter, Rhode Island, to the dense, uncharted wilderness of the early American frontier requires us to look at an era when the boundaries of the physical world were heavily dictated by isolation, deep religious conviction, and an underlying dread of the unknown. In the late autumn of 1817, the rolling hills surrounding the Red River in Adams, Tennessee, were home to a community of highly resilient, deeply conservative pioneers who had spent generations carving a structured civilization out of the rugged southern landscape. At the absolute center of this developing territory was the vast, highly prosperous farmstead of John Bell. John was a deeply respected patriarch, a successful independent landowner who had migrated from North Carolina with his wife Lucy and their children to establish a pristine family estate. He was a man of rigorous personal discipline, known across the county for his baseline integrity, his agricultural wealth, and his unshakable standing within the local church. The Bell household operated with a predictable, rhythmic efficiency, completely removed from any baseline social conflict or systemic instability. But the structural piece of this frontier sanctuary was about to be completely violated by an invisible, highly intelligent force that would launch the most thoroughly documented and terrifying anatomical siege in federal history. The baseline atmospheric disruptions initiated their run on a crisp afternoon while John Bell was executing a routine survey of his expansive cornfields. Navigating between the high, withered stalks, his eyes caught a bizarre physical anomaly resting directly between the rows. Sitting motionless against the earth was an unidentifiable creature possessing the muscular body of an oversized black dog, but the distinct structural head of a wild rabbit. Startled by this unnatural biological configuration, John immediately raised his utility rifle and fired multiple rounds directly at the animal. The bullets appeared to strike the frame, yet the creature did not emit a single baseline vocalization or leave a trace of blood spatter on the soil. Instead, it simply dissolved into the crisp air, leaving John to stand in a state of quiet, localized confusion. Within 48 hours, the visual anomalies expanded, with his young sons encountering an exceptionally large, unidentified bird of prey hovering low over the property line, exhibiting an unnatural mechanical flight pattern before vanishing into the canopy. The family initially chose to keep these incidents entirely quiet, fearing that a public disclosure would heavily damage their pristine social and commercial reputation within the county. But the entity was merely mapping the perimeter of the homestead, preparing to breach the heavy timber framework of the house itself. The auditory and physical violations commenced in the dead of night, shattering the absolute silence of the master bedroom with a sudden, rhythmic scraping sound against the outer logs of the structure. It was an erratic, scratching noise that mimicked a large animal attempting to tear through the wood with massive claws. Within a matter of weeks, the phantom sounds migrated inside the domestic space, manifesting as a heavy, continuous chewing sound focused on the base of the children's bedposts. The family would ignite lanterns and sweep the rooms with weapons drawn, only to find the spaces completely empty and undisturbed. The phenomenon rapidly graduated from simple auditory irritation to severe targeted physical trauma, primarily focusing its volatile energy on the youngest daughter, Betsy Bell. While sleeping, the young girl would suddenly wake in a state of life-or-death panic as her blankets were violently stripped from her frame by an invisible force. Before her parents could intervene, Betsy would be subjected to a succession of sharp, manual slaps to her face and upper torso, accompanied by the distinct sound of her hair being violently pulled from her scalp. Severe, dark welts and precise finger-shaped contortions would manifest on her skin in real time, under the direct observation of her family, completely defying any natural medical explanation. As the physical toll began to systematically destroy the health of his children, John Bell recognized that his baseline isolation was no longer tactically viable, forcing him to confide in his closest neighbor and trusted friend, James Johnston. Johnston was a highly rational, analytical pioneer who possessed a deep skepticism regarding supernatural folklore. Determined to expose the phenomenon as a crude domestic hoax or a localized trick engineered by local land rivals, Johnston and his wife agreed to spend multiple nights inside the plagued bedroom. Their baseline skepticism completely collapsed before dawn. Johnston experienced his own bedding being forcefully ripped from his grip, followed by a succession of heavy, unseen blows delivered to his shoulders that left him breathless. Recognizing that the Bell family was facing a profound, unclassifiable emergency, Johnston mobilized the community's leadership, forming an independent investigative committee of local doctors, religious leaders, and frontier scouts to conduct a meticulous, multi-week surveillance of the property. They checked the floorboards for hidden mechanisms, inspected the chimney flues for ventriloquism devices, and carefully monitored Betsy's facial muscles to rule out conscious fraud, but every single logical hypothesis rapidly deteriorated into a systemic dead end. The localized crisis reached a national level of prominence in 1819, when General Andrew Jackson, a hardened military commander, a hero of the War of 1812, and a future president of the United States, decided to intervene personally. Intrigued by the official reports filtering out of Tennessee, and confident that his veteran tactical experience would easily dismantle what he assumed to be an elaborate rural prank, Jackson traveled to the Red River with an elite team of armed soldiers and a specialized investigator who claimed to possess advanced tools for debunking occult phenomena. As Jackson's heavy military wagon approached the perimeter of the Bell property, the horses suddenly froze in place. Despite the driver utilizing high-leverage whips and the soldiers physically throwing their weight against the wheels, the vehicle remained completely immovable, as if anchored deep into the earth by a massive magnetic force. Jackson looked around the clear, open trail and openly declared that the invisible entity was tracking them. Moments later, a low, metallic voice echoed from the surrounding brush, informing the general that they could proceed. The wagon instantly rolled forward with absolute ease, instantly plunging the military unit into a state of intense baseline anxiety. The investigative unit established a secure camp on the property, and that evening, Jackson's specialized debunker attempted to execute an aggressive demonstration to flush out the entity. Armed with a heavy pistol loaded with solid silver bullets, the man began pacing the parlor, loudly shouting taunts into the empty air and declaring that the phenomenon was nothing more than a baseline fraud. Before he could complete his sentence, his frame was suddenly seized by an immense, invisible physical force. The investigator was violently contorted, his arms pinned to his sides as he was systematically dragged around the room by his hair, emitting cries of absolute terror before being forcefully ejected through the front door into the dirt. General Andrew Jackson, a man who had faced the elite infantry of the British Empire without ever losing his baseline composure, was completely undone by the display. Under the cover of early morning mist, before the sun had even broken over the horizon, Jackson ordered his men to completely abandon their equipment and retreat from the county, later uttering his iconic historical reflection that he would rather face the entire British army in open combat then spend another hour inside the Bell homestead. The turning point of the entire investigation manifested shortly after Jackson's retreat, when the entity officially developed the capacity for fluent, highly articulate speech. Shifting away from chaotic throat growls, the force began utilizing a distinct, highly resonant voice that could project from any coordinate within the room, rapidly demonstrating a terrifying, multi-location omnipresence. During a formal evaluation conducted by local church elders, the entity executed a physical feat that completely shattered the working hoax theory. It held 3 entirely distinct, highly intellectual theological conversations with separate groups of observers inside 3 completely closed, insulated rooms at the exact same moment, responding to unvoiced, internal thoughts with an absolute, immediate frequency. The entity began demonstrating a profound, omniscient command of data, effortlessly reciting the exact contents of private diaries locked in distant townships and exposing the deep, hidden personal secrets of anyone who stepped across the threshold. It was a flawless, calculating mind that seemed to view the human brain as an open ledger. As the months transitioned into 1820, the entity's intelligence operations shifted from simple psychological observation to grand geopolitical prophecy. In front of a large gathering of regional officials and traveling scholars, the voice began mapping out a detailed historical timeline of the North American continent. With absolute clinical precision, the entity delivered a comprehensive forecast of a massive, devastating internal military conflict that would tear the United States apart, explicitly describing the geographical boundaries, the structural collapse of the economy, and the precise ideological battle lines of the American Civil War, a conflict that would not initiate its active run until 40 years after the entity delivered the words. The listeners sat in a state of absolute, paralyzed awe, unable to comprehend how an invisible force in a remote Tennessee cabin could possess a perfect mathematical blueprint of a future global catastrophe. But this grand display of global omniscience was merely a distraction. The entity was preparing to execute its primary lethal objective against the family patriarch. The final diagnostic collapse of John Bell initiated its run in the late autumn of 1820. For months, the entity had been subjecting the aging father to an unyielding form of physical torture, utilizing manual force to distort his facial muscles, cause severe tongue paralysis, and induce sudden, violent neurological seizures during his daily farm routines. On the morning of December 19th, John fell into a deep, completely unresponsive stupor within his bed. His son, John Bell Jr., rushed to the medical cabinet to retrieve his father's standard prescribed diagnostic formula, only to find the medicine had been entirely removed. In its place rested a small, highly unusual vial filled with a dark, completely unidentifiable liquid chemical compound. Sensing an immediate tactical violation, the family brought in the attending town physician, Dr. George Hobson, to perform a rigorous analysis of the substance. Dr. Hobson executed a baseline test utilizing a clean glass rod to administer a single drop of the dark fluid to the tongue of a healthy farm cat. Within a matter of seconds, the animal's respiratory system suffered a catastrophic, absolute failure. Its muscles contorted violently, its lungs packed with fluid, and it suffocated to death on the floor. Before the medical team could even process the results of the chemical analysis, the invisible entity erupted into a state of manic, echoing laughter that saturated the upper corners of the bedroom framework. The voice loudly declared that it had systematically entered the home under the cover of night, destroyed the original prescription, and directly administered the lethal poison to John Bell while he was sleeping to ensure his complete systemic elimination. John Bell passed away the following morning without ever regaining consciousness, his internal organs suffering total systemic failure from the chemical intervention. The funeral process was the largest ever recorded in the history of the territory, with thousands of citizens traveling across the state line to witness the burial of the fractured patriarch. As the heavy timber casket was lowered deep into the Tennessee soil, the absolute silence of the cemetery was suddenly violated by the entity. The voice began loudly and clearly singing a mocking, upbeat drinking song from the branches of the old oak canopy above, maintaining the acoustic display until the final shovelful of earth was packed flat over the grave, leaving the community to face a cold, lingering sense of collective dread. The phenomena surrounding the Bell Witch entity officially subsided in 1821, with the force delivering a final vocal declaration promising to return to the descendants of the family exactly 7 years later, and subsequently executing a brief, documented manifestation in 1935, before vanishing entirely into the historical record. Modern historical investigators and clinical behavioral psychologists who have reviewed the extensive corporate and legal diaries of the case look at the timeline not as a simple haunting, but as an exceptionally advanced, targeted psychological assassination model designed to manipulate land inheritances, fracture family lineages, and alter the socio-economic architecture of the Red River Valley. The case remains archived within the highest levels of federal anomalous history, as the only instance where a physical death was officially attributed to an invisible, intelligent, non-human entity, leaving a dark, permanent scar on the history of the American frontier. The quiet hills of Adams, Tennessee, have slowly paved over the physical traces of the Bell Plantation, with the original cabins long since reduced to timber dust beneath the southern sun. But as the memory of the poisoned patriarch fades into folklore, the dark trajectory of the unexplainable moves away from the haunted forests of the mid-19th century, traveling toward the deep, freezing shipping lanes of the open Atlantic Ocean, where a massive commercial vessel would soon be discovered floating in perfect structural order, completely devoid of its human crew. The terrifying, absolute omniscience of the Bell Witch entity would eventually fade into the quiet foliage of the Tennessee hills, leaving behind a scarred lineage and an open ledger of historical anomalies that defined the early 19th century. But as the American landscape entered the modern era of industrial shipping, the dark focus of the unexplainable migrated away from the haunted inland forests, traveling east toward the vast, unpredictable expanses of the open ocean. We move from the suffocating domestic terror of a remote frontier cabin to the absolute, freezing isolation of the Atlantic coast, where a massive commercial vessel would soon demonstrate that a ship can remain in perfect structural alignment while its human core completely dissolves into the ether. To understand how a multi-agency federal investigation was completely brought to its knees by an architectural ghost, one must look at the treacherous maritime landscape of Cape Hatteras, North Carolina. Known universally to generations of mariners as the graveyard of the Atlantic, this lonely stretch of the Outer Banks forms a violent geographical crossroads where the warm, accelerating currents of the Gulf Stream collide directly with the freezing, high-pressure waters of the Labrador Current. The secondary result of this continuous ocean warfare is Diamond Shoals, a massive, shifting labyrinth of hidden sandbars extending miles out into the open sea, completely invisible beneath the breaking surf. For centuries, this zone has acted as a sterile underwater trap, claiming thousands of vessels and burying their physical histories beneath the dark coastal sands. It was an environment defined by baseline hazardous parameters, where even the most experienced captains operated with an intense sense of tactical caution. But in the early winter of 1921, the Shoals would capture a vessel whose true mystery did not lie within the destructive power of the water, but within a cold, calculated sequence of events executed behind closed cabin doors. The vessel at the absolute center of this maritime anomaly was the Carroll A. Deering, a magnificent 5-masted commercial cargo schooner constructed in Maine by the prominent G.G. Deering Company. Launched in 1919, the ship was a pristine example of modern wooden naval architecture, stretching over 250 feet in length and designed to transport massive volumes of coal along the lucrative international shipping lanes. She was a robust, heavily disciplined vessel, utilizing a highly complex rigging network that required absolute coordination from her seasoned 11-man crew. In the late summer of 1920, the Deering initiated a routine commercial run, setting sail from Boston with a cargo of coal destined for Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. The command structure was originally placed in the hands of Captain Willis Wormel, a widely respected and fiercely analytical master mariner who possessed an unblemished record of safe transits. But as the ship prepared to depart its midway port, Captain Wormel suffered a sudden, severe medical collapse, necessitating an immediate and highly irregular administrative shift. Command of the 5-masted schooner was abruptly transferred to a replacement master, Captain Charles B. Jacobson, an aging and deeply eccentric officer whose volatile relationship with his subordinates immediately introduced a dark baseline friction into the vessel's landscape. Jacobson was a man who operated under a state of intense, borderline psychotic hypervigilance, fiercely guarding his private logbooks and constantly expressing deep paranoia regarding the ultimate loyalty of his crew. During a brief logistical stop in Rio de Janeiro and subsequent refueling window in Barbados, independent harbor officials noted that the structural discipline aboard the Deering had completely deteriorated. The first mate was overheard in local taverns, openly expressing an intense hatred for Jacobson, casting explosive remarks regarding the captain's mental stability, and stating to local merchants that the command structure would be permanently altered before the ship ever reached its final destination in Virginia. Yet, despite these ominous behavioral warnings, the Deering cleared port in January of 1921, navigating north along the American coast before vanishing into the absolute silence of the open ocean. The baseline operational timeline ruptured on the morning of January 29th, when the Deering passed the lonely perimeter of the Cape Lookout lightship off the coast of North Carolina. The lightship keeper, a disciplined observer trained to track passing hull configurations, noted that the five-masted schooner was executing a highly irregular, wandering course through the shipping lanes. As the vessel drew adjacent to the lightship, a tall, unidentified man with a heavy foreign accent emerged onto the quarterdeck, utilizing a high-powered megaphone to shout a frantic, contradictory message across the water. He informed the keeper that the Deering had lost both of its primary iron anchors during a recent storm, requesting that the coordinate data be immediately relayed to the shipping company offices. Meticulous forensic review of the lightship logs later revealed a terrifying detail. The man executing the voice command was not Captain Jacobson, and his physical posture did not match the rigid behavioral profile of a certified master. Behind him, the remaining members of the crew were observed wandering aimlessly across the main deck, completely devoid of their standard maritime uniforms and exhibiting zero baseline discipline. The ship drifted into the winter mist, an active ghost unit operating without a pilot. The physical discovery of the disaster manifested at precisely 6:30 on the morning of January 31st, when a coastal lookout stationed at the Cape Hatteras Coast Guard unit spotted the massive silhouette of the Deering driven hard onto the outer shoals of Diamond Bar. The vessel was entirely stranded, its five masts silhouetted against the gray winter sky, with the high Atlantic surf violently battering the pristine white hull. Because a severe, high-pressure storm system was currently moving through the region, generating catastrophic sea parameters, rescue cutters were completely unable to bridge the breaking surf for multiple days. For nearly 96 hours, the community watched from the shoreline as the silent vessel rocked rhythmically against the sand, its sails set and snapping in the freezing wind, completely devoid of any visible human activity on the upper decks. It was a visual configuration of absolute isolation that sent a wave of localized dread through the island population. When the environmental parameters finally stabilized, allowing a heavily armed Coast Guard rescue team to officially board the stranded craft, they stepped into a physical environment that defied every established rule of a standard maritime tragedy. The exterior inspection revealed that the ship's primary lifeboats had been cleanly and methodically lowered from their structural davits, suggesting a planned evacuation event had taken place before the hull struck the sandbar. But when investigators descended into the dark living quarters of the hull, the hypothesis of a chaotic emergency abandonment completely collapsed. The interior spaces were in a state of absolute, pristine order. Personal belongings, clothing, and heavy sea chests belonging to the 11 missing men remained perfectly arranged within their respective berths, completely untouched by the ocean water. Most unsettling of all was the state of the ship's galley. Resting flat upon the cast iron stoves were large pots of food ribs, pea soup, and fresh coffee pots that had been left cooking, with the biological tissue entirely preserved but frozen solid by the invading winter air. The table had been meticulously set for a communal meal, as if the entire crew had been systematically plucked from their chairs in a single silent moment. But as the forensic team migrated to the captain's private quarters and the navigation bridge, they confronted an intentional, clinical devastation of data. The room was an absolute void. Every single piece of high-leverage navigational technology, the master brass chronometers, the ship's logging equipment, the sextants, and the heavy main compass had been cleanly and deliberately severed from their structural mounts and removed from the vessel. The official logbooks tracking the ship's daily geographical coordinates and administrative entries had been systematically stripped from the bridge desk. The multi-agency federal investigation, pulling in resources from the Department of Justice, the United States Navy, and the Department of Commerce under the direct supervision of a young Herbert Hoover, rapidly ground to an absolute behavioral deadlock. Detectives chased a succession of high-profile red herrings, aggressively launched lines of inquiry that focused on international pirate syndicates operating out of the Caribbean shipping lanes, violent crew mutinies engineered by the volatile first mate, and even a sudden, catastrophic rogue weather phenomenon that might have forced the men to abandon the hull. Agents tracked down suspected black market harbor masters across the eastern seaboard, but every lead consistently dissolved into a bureaucratic stone wall, yielding zero physical remains, zero skeletal data, and zero actionable leads. The turning point of the entire mystery manifested during a meticulous secondary forensic evaluation of Captain Jacobson's private state cabin, executed under the direction of a veteran naval investigator who refused to accept the institutional silence of the scene. While performing a microspatial survey of the timber furniture, he noticed a hidden latch built flat into the interior framework of the captain's desk drawer. When the hidden partition was released, it revealed the ship's internal logistics supply ledger, a document that the extraction team had completely overlooked during their systematic clearing of the bridge records. As the investigator carefully turned the final parchment pages under high baseline illumination, expecting to find nothing more than a standard accounting of dry provisions, fuel oil, and harbor tariffs, he confronted a physical modification that completely inverted the established geometry of the case. The final page of the ledger was completely covered in a dense, highly sophisticated navigation matrix drawn entirely in dark, dried human blood. The complex vectors and mathematical equations did not chart a return course to the safety of the North Carolina coast or indicate a local emergency harbor line. Instead, the geometric grid points aligned directly to an entirely empty, featureless coordinate situated within the deep, open expanse of the Sargasso Sea, a dead zone of stagnant water and dense vegetation entirely removed from any known commercial shipping routes, underwater shelves, or geographical landmasses. This terrifying discovery allowed federal intelligence agents to completely reconstruct the true sequence of events, proving that previous models had merely analyzed the disaster from the wrong psychological angle. The 11 missing men had not been targeted by an international pirate syndicate or overtaken by a chaotic crew mutiny. They had fallen victim to a clinical, highly organized psychological trap engineered by Captain Jacobson himself. Driven to a state of absolute existential paranoia by his underlying psychiatric decline, Jacobson had utilized his unchallenged structural authority to systematically manipulate the ship's navigational instruments over a span of weeks, feeding false coordinate data to his officers and completely isolating them from reality. The megaphone announcement to the lightship was a pre-calculated performance designed to establish a false physical record of terminal anchor failure, providing a logical cover for the final extraction phase. Under the absolute isolation of a moonless winter night, Jacobson had executed his final operational command. He had forced the entire crew to assemble on the bridge, utilizing a clinical weapon or structural coercion to harvest the biological fluid required to finalize his bloody chart grid. Believing they were navigating toward a secret state sanctuary or escaping a phantom threat that existed only within the captain's mind, the 11 men had methodically stripped the ship of its tracking instruments, lowered the lifeboats, and willingly rowed straight into the empty heart of the open ocean, leaving their magnificent 5-masted schooner to drift helplessly onto the sands of Diamond Shoals as an empty physical monument to their captain's absolute psychological collapse. The federal government officially closed the administrative ledger on the Carroll A, Deering in late 1921, completely unable to locate a single fragment of the missing lifeboats or recover any trace of the 11 lost souls. The pristine wooden hull remained stranded on the shifting sandbars of North Carolina for months, drawing thousands of curious onlookers before the state finally utilized massive charges of dynamite to completely destroy the structure, clearing the shipping lanes and scattering the historic timbers into the cold Atlantic surf. The case remains preserved within the cold case archives of maritime history as the ultimate ghost vessel anomaly of the American coast, a chilling reminder that when a ship dissolves into silence, the true predator is often not the fury of the water, but the dark, uncharted spaces hidden within the human mind. The echoing waves of Cape Hatteras would eventually wash away the physical reminders of the stranded schooner, leaving the Outer Banks to return to their baseline rhythms. But as the maritime world moves forward, the dark focus of the unexplainable travels back toward the rural, landlocked heart of the Appalachian Mountains, migrating toward a quiet hillside in Braxton County, West Virginia, where a small group of rural citizens would soon confront an environmental contamination event that left permanent biological mutations within their bodies, the silent, vanishing lifeboats of the Carroll A. Deering and the bloody navigation charts left within the captain's hidden desk drawer would eventually settle into the classified archives of maritime mystery, leaving the Outer Banks of North Carolina to return to their baseline oceanic rhythms. But as the American landscape entered the modern anxieties of the mid-20th century, the dark trajectory of the unexplainable migrated away from the deep shipping lanes of the Atlantic, traveling back toward the dense, isolated ridges of the Appalachian Mountains. We move from the absolute freezing isolation of a stranded ocean vessel to the early autumn heat of a small rural township in Braxton County, West Virginia. In September of 1952, this quiet mountain community would find its baseline safety completely shattered by a sudden flash in the evening sky, initiating a complex toxicological crisis and a sweeping military intelligence cover-up that left permanent biological scars on the local population. To understand how a routine evening among neighborhood children rapidly transformed into a high-level national security containment event, one must look at the unique historical parameters of West Virginia during the early years of the Cold War. The town of Flatwoods was a peaceful, deeply traditional settlement where daily life was dictated by agriculture, local logging operations, and predictable family schedules. The height of international geopolitical tensions had created a baseline matrix of psychological anxiety across the United States, with families frequently monitoring the skies and participating in civil defense drills. But for the young boys of the May and Fisher families, the concerns of global warfare were entirely secondary to the immediate freedom of a late summer evening. On the night of September 12th, a group of local schoolboys were playing outside on the community lawn, navigating the dusk parameters of a local cow pasture. They were familiar with every ridge, every timber line, and every baseline path crossing the local hillsides, operating with an absolute sense of geographical comfort. But at precisely 7:15 in the evening, a sudden, blinding aerial anomaly ruptured the twilight, drawing every eye in the county toward the crest of an isolated hillside. The object was described by multiple independent witnesses across 3 states as a brilliant, fiery crimson sphere traveling through the upper atmosphere at an exceptional rate of speed. To the local children, it appeared to decelerate abruptly directly over the town limits, its trajectory changing before it apparently impacted the high ground of a remote hill property owned by a local farmer. Enticed by genuine human curiosity and assuming they were about to discover the remains of a standard commercial aviation accident or a stray weather balloon, the boys rushed back to the May household to alert Kathleen May, a disciplined local mother who also operated as a volunteer nurse. Kathleen gathered a heavy utility lantern, enlisted the assistance of an 18-year-old National Guardsman named Eugene Lemon, and together, the small investigative unit of 7 citizens initiated an ascension up the steep, unlit mountain trail under the cover of a dense Appalachian darkness. As the group breached the upper elevation of the ridgeline, the familiar baseline parameters of the West Virginia forest completely disintegrated, replaced by a highly irregular and deeply unsettling physical environment. Long before they achieved visual confirmation of the impact site, the air temperature surged noticeably, and an intense, suffocating chemical vapor began drifting down through the underbrush. The witnesses noted an immediate, bitter taste on their tongues, accompanied by a heavy, thick stench that perfectly mimicked a combination of burnt electrical wiring, volatile sulfur, and hot industrial engine oil. The vapor was so dense that it caused their eyes to water continuously and induced a low, raw burning sensation within their throats. Navigating through the thick mountain mist, Eugene Lemon raised his high-powered electric flashlight, sweeping the beam across the dark clearing of the hillside. The light caught a massive, pulsating sphere of dark crimson energy resting silently against the earth, letting out a low, rhythmic, mechanical humming sound that vibrated directly through the soles of their boots. But it was the sudden manifestation directly adjacent to the object that plunged the small civil search party into a state of absolute life-or-death panic. Hovering silently near the edge of a massive oak tree, was a towering 10-foot-tall mechanical entity. The figure possessed a rigid outer chassis that appeared to be constructed out of a dark, non-reflective green metal plating topped by a large, spade-shaped hood architecture that perfectly mirrored the structural geometry of an ace of spades. Within the absolute darkness of the hood structure sat two massive circular eyes that emitted a intense, hyper-focused beam of blue-green metallic light, sweeping over the underbrush with a calculated efficiency. As the flashlight beam locked onto the figure, the entity let out a high-pitched mechanical hiss and began gliding smoothly across the terrain directly toward the group, completely independent of any physical leg structures, its metallic frame releasing a concentrated burst of the toxic sulfurous mist directly into their faces. Eugene Lemon dropped his light source in a state of sheer terror, and the entire group fled down the mountain trail, their breathing heavily labored as they collapsed into the safety of the town center. Local police authorities, led by Braxton County Sheriff Robert Carr, quickly launched a thorough review of the incident, arriving at the hillside property within an hour of the initial emergency calls. But as the traditional investigative process initiated its run, detectives were immediately met with a succession of regional red herrings and systemic administrative dead ends. Early news broadcasts and federal civil defense representatives aggressively attempted to downplay the incident, issuing formal public statements claiming that the children had merely suffered a collective psychological delusion triggered by a falling meteor and a large barn owl nesting on a tree branch. Skeptics argued that the low-intensity light was nothing more than an optical illusion caused by a local aviation beacon, and that the heavy chemical odor was the natural result of decomposing mountain vegetation. But this superficial baseline narrative was completely destroyed the following morning when independent local reporters returned to the clearing. They discovered a series of neat parallel skid marks pressed flat into the soil, accompanied by a large circle of completely charred, melted grass tissue that retained the distinct, bitter chemical odor of refined petroleum and metallic oil. The true turning point of the entire investigation manifested within 48 hours of the encounter, migrating away from the physical crime scene and focusing directly within the clinical corridors of the Braxton County Medical Ward. Every single one of the 7 witnesses who had breathed in the toxic mountain mist began demonstrating a rapid, uniform pattern of severe biological deterioration. They were admitted to the emergency clinic presenting acute esophageal swelling, continuous projectile vomiting, severe neurological tremors, and localized muscle spasms that left them completely incapacitated. The attending town doctors noted that their throats were heavily blistered and raw, mimicking the exact clinical signature of individuals who had been directly exposed to mustard gas or high-leverage industrial chemical weapons during military operations. The diagnostic data proved an undeniable medical reality. This was not a psychological reaction to an owl. This was a severe, systemic, physiological response to a localized toxicological contamination event. Before the local medical team could compile their official laboratory findings and enter the data into the public record, an unprecedented administrative intervention took place inside the hospital. Armed military personnel, accompanied by unidentified federal agents operating under the guise of commercial geological surveyors, completely cordoned off the mountain range and established an absolute lockdown on the county records database. They systematically confiscated every trace of the soil samples gathered by local researchers, dismantled the physical track marks on the hillside, and physically extracted the witnesses' private diagnostic files from the hospital registry. The clinical data tracking the biological mutations and respiratory trauma was permanently stamped with maximum national security classification codes and systematically expunged from the state's historical archives, leaving behind a stone wall of institutional silence. With the enforcement of this absolute data blackout, the true mind-bending geometry of the Flatwoods encounter is finally laid bare, proving that the previous explanations had merely viewed the disaster from a completely compromised perspective. The object that descended over Braxton County in September of 1952 was not a meteor or a traditional aviation vehicle. It was a highly classified, experimental high-altitude reconnaissance platform carrying a volatile, next-generation radiological chemical payload, developed under a secret military defense program. The operation had suffered a catastrophic technical malfunction, causing the platform to drop out of the upper atmosphere and impact the West Virginia hillside. The towering 10-foot-tall entity encountered by the children was not a biological creature from another world. It was an automated, mechanical containment and retrieval chassis deployed directly from the chassis of the craft. It was designed to automatically secure the highly sensitive wreckage and protect the classified technical data from civilian compromise. The dense, sulfurous mist was a pre-programmed, defensive chemical countermeasure engineered to induce immediate physiological incapacitation in any unauthorized individuals who breached the operational perimeter. The military lockdown was not an erratic response to a local rumor. It was a coordinated recovery matrix designed to secure the experimental wreckage and permanently erase the clinical evidence of a domestic chemical contamination event before the public could comprehend the true nature of the weapon. System operating in their own skies. The long-term aftermath of the Flatwoods incident left a permanent scar on the health of the surviving witnesses. For the rest of their natural lives, members of the May and Fisher families suffered from chronic respiratory complications, lifelong esophageal sensitivity, and unexplainable neurological tremors that modern doctors directly attribute to acute mid-century chemical poisoning. The lonely hillside in Braxton County, West Virginia, has slowly returned to its natural wilderness state, with the charred circle of earth eventually covered by new mountain foliage. But as the memory of the mechanical entity fades into historical folklore, the dark trajectory of the unexplainable moves away from the toxic open clearings of the Appalachian Ridges, traveling southwest toward a massive, imposing stone complex in Louisville, Kentucky, where a hidden subterranean corridor designed to transport the dead would soon become the focal point of a terrifying psychological epidemic among the living. To understand how a structural space can be systematically transformed into a clinical engine of psychological destruction, we have to leave the environmental quarantine of the West Virginia hills and travel back to the towering, Gothic architecture of an early 20th century medical sanctuary. In the year 1910, a massive, imposing stone structure opened its heavy double doors on a windswept, isolated hilltop in Louisville, Kentucky. This was the Waverly Hills Sanatorium, a specialized medical facility engineered to combat the devastating expansion of the White Death, the global tuberculosis epidemic that was systematically hollowed out the respiratory systems of thousands of American citizens before the discovery of modern antibiotic pharmacology. The sanatorium was designed to operate as a completely self-contained micro-society, an absolute quarantine zone situated far away from the crowded urban centers of the state. Inside this isolated stone fortress, a dedicated staff of young, exceptionally disciplined nurses lived and worked under a continuous matrix of professional trauma, their entire existence dedicated to managing thousands of terminal cases within an environment defined by absolute containment and an underlying baseline of existential dread. The domestic landscape of the sanatorium was rigorously organized, alternating between large, open-air treatment pavilions where patients were exposed to freezing winter currents in a desperate attempt to stimulate pulmonary recovery, and specialized administrative hubs situated on the upper levels. At the absolute center of this architectural layout was Room 502, a primary treatment and nursing station located on the 5th floor. This room served as the operational core for the upper wards, a space where caregivers compiled medical charts, coordinated diagnostic runs, and managed the delicate emotional baselines of individuals who recognized they were facing a terminal medical outcome. The nurses who navigated this specific ward were selected for their exceptional psychological stability, independent professionals who possessed an unyielding commitment to logistical order and clinical efficiency. They worked exhausting multi-hour shifts, completely cut off from their families and the outside world, forming an exceptionally tight-knit community within the stone walls. But beneath the clean, clinical success of the facility, an invisible, volatile tension was quietly gathering within the structural framework of the hill itself, rooted entirely in a bizarre mechanical necessity that the directors attempted to hide from the public consciousness. As the epidemic reached its catastrophic peak in the mid-1920s, the mortality rate inside Waverly Hills rapidly escalated into an industrial-scale crisis. Wards that were engineered to house a modest number of patients were completely overwhelmed, and multiple individuals were perishing every single day. The sanatorium directors recognized that witnessing a continuous, endless procession of coffins leaving the main entrance would completely destroy the fragile psychological morale of the surviving patients, causing their biological systems to decline even faster under the weight of absolute despair. To correct this administrative problem, engineers executed a massive, hidden structural intervention beneath the foundations of the complex. They constructed the death tunnel, a hidden, 150-meter subterranean concrete and stone chute that cut directly through the dark center of the hill, linking the upper treatment wings directly to an isolated railway line at the base of the ridge. Under the cover of midnight, when the patients were confined to their beds in absolute darkness, the staff would utilize this underground chute to silently slide the frozen remains of the deceased down the steep incline to waiting unmarked hearses, ensuring that the industrial volume of death remained completely invisible to the living world. The baseline stability of the institution completely ruptured in the winter of 1928 when a highly disturbing sequence of behavioral anomalies began to manifest among the nursing staff assigned specifically to room 502. It initiated with subtle, irregular shifts in their daily habits. Caregivers who had spent years demonstrating an unshakable baseline resilience suddenly began presenting signs of severe spatial disorientation, chronic sleep deprivation, and a low, continuous state of irrational panic. They reported experiencing an unexplainable rhythmic vibration migrating directly through the concrete floorboards of the treatment station, accompanied by a faint, distant acoustic scraping sound that seemed to hum within the interior framework of the walls. The local doctors conducted basic physical evaluations, assuming the women were simply suffering from advanced professional burnout and workplace exhaustion. But the superficial baseline explanation completely collapsed on a freezing morning when the senior supervisor entered room 502, only to freeze in a state of absolute, localized terror. Suspended flat against the high ceiling fixtures of the treatment room was the lifeless frame of a 29-year-old nurse, her uniform pristine, but her cervical vertebrae completely shattered by a sudden manual hanging event. The tragedy deeply traumatized the entire institution, but local authorities quickly moved to close the ledger, ruling the incident a tragic suicide induced by severe workplace depression. This administrative resolution proved catastrophic. Less than 24 months later, a secondary identical behavioral decline manifested in the replacement nurse assigned to the exact same fifth-floor coordinate. Witnesses reported seeing the young woman calmly executing her routine chart updates before suddenly dropping her medical equipment, walking directly out onto the adjacent roofline pavilion, and stepping into the void, her body suffering massive, fatal blunt force trauma on the concrete steps below. The local police detectives, accompanied by independent county coroners, launched a comprehensive, high-stakes investigation inside the quarantine facility, desperate to identify the underlying actor responsible for the consecutive deaths of two clinically stable state professionals. The early investigation heavily targeted regional red herrings, with detectives aggressively pursue lines of inquiry that focused on hidden romantic entanglements with the administrative directors, clandestine financial blackmail rings operating within the tuberculosis wards, or the potential intervention of a rogue, violent patient who was covertly accessing the upper levels to target the caregivers. Investigators methodically dismantled the interior woodwork of room 502, checking the window latches for signs of forced entry, and monitoring the restricted access keys to the fifth-floor pavilion. But every single traditional track consistently dissolved into a bureaucratic dead end. There were no signs of a physical struggle, no defensive markings on the remains, and zero physical data connecting any living suspect to the crime scenes. The environment itself seemed to be executing the violence, leaving the investigative unit to face an absolute wall of institutional silence. The true turning point of the entire mystery manifested when an independent team of state auditors conducted a meticulous excavation of the administrative storage vaults, recovering the private personal diaries and journals left behind by the deceased caregivers. As researchers carefully turned the weathered parchment pages, expecting to find standard expressions of grief, personal stress, or clinical fatigue, they confronted a physical and linguistic configuration that completely inverted the established logic of the case. The early journal entries documented a highly organized, professional mindset, but as the dates closely aligned with their assignments to room 502, the handwriting rapidly degenerated into a volatile, erratic script. The diaries contained absolutely zero references to depression, romantic conflicts, or workplace anxiety. Instead, the final pages of each volume were filled with lines of identical, rhythmically scrawled sentences that repeated a single, terrifying phrase with a mechanical frequency. The journals revealed that the women were not planning their own destruction, They were responding to an absolute acoustic command, writing continuously that the mechanical screeching of the body gurney wheels traveling through the dark center of the stone tunnel was physically calling out their names from deep inside the floorboards. This incredible discovery allowed a modern team of neurological paths and acoustic structural engineers to completely reconstruct the true, terrifying sequence of events from a biomechanical angle, proving that previous investigators had analyzed the space from a completely compromised perspective. The deaths in room 502 were not caused by suicidal ideation or a human predator. They were the direct result of a profound architectural anomaly within the death tunnel itself. The engineers discovered that the long 150-meter underground concrete chute acted as a massive natural acoustic amplifier. When the heavy, iron-wheeled gurneys carrying the remains of the deceased were slid down the steep concrete incline at midnight, the mechanical friction against the stone frame generated a continuous, low-frequency sound wave known as infrasound, vibrating at a frequency below the threshold of conscious human hearing. Because of a structural alignment within the elevator shafts and ventilation ducts, these invisible high-leverage vibrational pulses traveled directly up through the center of the hill, converging with absolute intensity within the confined spatial geometry of room 502. While the nurses could not consciously hear the noise, the infrasound waves were directly interacting with their physical brainstems and inner ear structures. Extended exposure to this specific sonic matrix is modernly verified to induce severe physiological degradation, including acute auditory hallucinations, a profound distortion of the space-time baseline, and an uncontrollable internal resonance that triggers a catastrophic neurological panic response. The rhythmic scraping recorded in their diaries was the physical vibration of the corpse gurneys, translating into their cognitive neurology. The architecture had manufactured a sonic trap that systematically hijacked their biological stability, inducing a state of acute cognitive collapse that physically compelled them to terminate their own lives to silence the unseen frequency vibrating within their bones. The sanatorium directors officially suspended operations at the Waverly Hills complex in 1961 following the widespread discovery of effective antibiotic treatments for tuberculosis, leaving the massive stone structure to sit as an empty, decaying shell on the Kentucky ridgeline. The empty, dark concrete chute of the death tunnel remains open to the elements to this day, a silent monument to a time when a well-intentioned medical sanctuary inadvertently manufactured a physical and neurological nightmare within its own foundations. But as the wilderness of the Kentucky hillside attempts to reclaim the stone ruins of the sanatorium, the dark trajectory of the unexplainable moves toward its final, most devastating destination, traveling back to a massive corporate mining project buried deep inside a West Virginia mountain range where a catastrophic corporate cover-up would fill the lungs of thousands of innocent men with pure, solid glass. In the summer of 1972, a team of university anthropologists and historical researchers were conducting a routine excavation across an abandoned, overgrown plantation site near the remote community of Golly Bridge, West Virginia. They were tracing the structural layouts of mid-19th century agricultural communities, digging narrow trench matrices into the deep mountain clay. As one of the junior excavators cleared away a dense layer of root systems and compacted topsoil, his spade struck a highly irregular, unyielding object buried deep within an unmarked rectangular depression. Expecting to uncover a standard piece of rusted iron farm equipment or a fragment of early colonial timber framework, the team methodically switched to delicate hand tools, carefully brushing away the dark Appalachian earth. What gradually materialized before them was a human skeleton, resting flat against the floor of a shallow trench, completely devoid of a traditional wooden casket or personal belongings. But it was not the absolute isolation of the burial that caused the attending forensic path biologists to completely hold their breath. It was the terrifying, mineralized configuration of the internal chest cavity. When they cleared the dirt from beneath the fragile rib cage, they discovered that the soft pulmonary tissues had not dissolved into the soil over the decades. Instead, both entire lung fields had completely fossilized, transforming into two solid, heavy, and razor-sharp blocks of pure translucent silica glass. It was a structural biological mutation that completely defied the standard linear parameters of natural decomposition, looking as if a glassblower had poured liquid quartz directly into the thoracic cavity of a living man, preserving his final agonizing breath within a cage of solid stone. To understand how this horrific anatomical anomaly came to be buried secretly beneath the soil of an old southern plantation, one must look back at the grim industrial landscape of Fayette County, West Virginia, during the opening months of 1930. The onset of the Great Depression had plunged the rural Appalachian region into absolute socioeconomic devastation, leaving thousands of displaced laborers, transient families, and migrant workers in a state of extreme financial desperation. Into this bleak environment stepped the Union Carbide and Carbon Corporation, a massive industrial conglomerate that had finalized tactical plans to construct an unprecedented engineering marvel near the village of Gauley Bridge. The project required the excavation of a massive 3-mile hydroelectric diversion tunnel directly through the heart of Gauley Mountain, designed to channel the high-velocity waters of the New River into a massive underground power station to feed nearby metallurgical factories. To execute this hazardous, high-stakes physical undertaking, the corporation contracted a heavy civil engineering firm named Reinhardt and Dennis, which immediately initiated an aggressive, nationwide recruitment sweep. They targeted thousands of impoverished African-American laborers who were desperately fleeing the structural oppression of the Jim Crow South, offering them the baseline promise of continuous daily wages, steady hard labor, and temporary residential quarters inside localized migrant camps situated along the mountain highway. The operational baseline of the project was established with a rapid mechanical efficiency, with over 2,000 men arriving at Gauley Mountain within a matter of weeks to begin working, rotating, 12-hour shifts in absolute isolation from the surrounding communities. The laborers were divided into tightly coordinated excavation teams, navigating the pitch-black parameters of the subterranean shafts, utilizing heavy pneumatic drills, dynamite charges, and primitive ore carts. But as the excavation lines advanced deep into the geological center of the mountain range, the engineering team encountered a massive, unforecasted layer of rock that completely altered the commercial geometry of the entire operation. Testing of the stone face revealed that they had breached a massive, pristine vein of pure sandstone containing an absolute concentration of over 99% pure silica quartz. This discovery instantly triggered an intense, volatile wave of corporate greed within the administrative offices. Pure silica was an exceptionally valuable industrial-grade raw material critical for the manufacturing of premium steel and high-leverage chemical compounds. Rather than treating the mineral vein as a hazardous environmental obstacle that required advanced tactical safety barriers, corporate management made a calculated, executive decision to alter the operational logic of the project, turning the construction of the hydroelectric tunnel into a covert, massive open-air silicon mining operation designed to maximize corporate profit margins at any human cost. The incident and the subsequent atmospheric violations inside Gauley Mountain initiated their run almost immediately following the discovery of the quartz vein. To extract the raw silicon as rapidly as possible, management ordered the excavation teams to utilize dry drilling techniques throughout the entire 3-mile shaft. In standard industrial engineering, drilling through sandstone requires a continuous stream of high-pressure water to be fed directly through the core of the pneumatic bit, a tactical practice known as wet drilling, which effectively binds the microscopic stone, dust into a heavy mud, preventing it from saturating the breathing zone of the workers. But because wet drilling was slightly slower and required more expensive utility lines, the corporation flatly prohibited its use, while simultaneously refusing to provide the over 2,000 migrant laborers with even the most baseline forms of personal respiratory protection. Within days, the interior of the Hawk's Nest Tunnel was transformed into a terrifying, suffocating nightmare. The air inside the unventilated shafts became so densely packed with pure quartz dust that it formed a blinding, bone-white fog that completely swallowed the output of their utility lanterns. The workers were forced to navigate this toxic baseline grid for 12 hours at a time, their skin, hair, and clothing completely caked in a fine white powder, looking like a procession of phantoms moving through a subterranean blizzard, completely blind to the fact that their pulmonary structures were being systematically shredded from the inside out. Within a matter of weeks, the biological devastation within the migrant camps reached a level of public crisis that could no longer be completely contained by corporate security. Healthy, robust young laborers who had entered the mountain shafts with absolute physical stamina began presenting a rapid, uniform pattern of sudden physical collapse. They would emerge from the tunnel mouth at the conclusion of their shifts in a state of severe respiratory exhaustion, their frames racked by a chronic, hacking cough that quickly graduated into projectile vomiting and massive internal bleeding. The men were literally suffocating while sitting in their crude timber bunks, their chests emitting a low, dry whistling sound as their breathing lines became completely non-functional. When the daily mortality rate began to skyrocket with mechanical frequency, a wave of profound psychological panic saturated the Gauley Bridge community. But instead of halting operations to investigate the physical parameters of the tunnel air, corporate representatives launched an aggressive, highly calculated public relations and legal defense matrix. They issued formal public statements claiming that the mounting fatalities inside the camps were completely unrelated to the engineering project, instead asserting that a sudden localized epidemic of acute, atypical pneumonia, which they labeled tunnel pneumonia, was sweeping through the migrant population due to poor baseline hygiene and dietary deficiencies inside their temporary quarters. The investigation into this corporate atrocity quickly became a labyrinth of systemic red herrings and institutional dead ends, engineered by company-aligned doctors and county officials who were paid to protect the legal immunity of the corporation. Detectives and local health inspectors followed a succession of false leads, aggressively launching public lines of inquiry that focused on contaminated water wells within the shantytowns, outbreaks of typhoid fever, or the potential spread of infectious respiratory viruses brought in by traveling drifters along Route 60. Company-appointed physicians systematically falsified the medical certificates of the dying men, officially entering pneumonia or tuberculosis as the baseline cause of death into the county registry to prevent the emergence of any actionable forensic data connecting the trauma to the silica mining. Whenever independent reporters or early labor rights advocates attempted to access the property line to gather air quality metrics or conduct interviews with the surviving workers, they were met by heavily armed private company guards who utilized physical force and legal trespass warnings to maintain an absolute baseline of operational secrecy around the mountain. The true turning point of the case manifested when a small, independent group of clandestine local journalists and non-aligned medical clean air advocates began noticing a highly irregular, numerical anomaly within the municipal records of neighboring townships. While the corporate narrative insisted that the dead workers were being safely transported back to their respective home states via traditional commercial shipping lines, federal transit ledgers yielded absolutely zero records of any such biological cargo leaving Fayette County. Driven by a cold sense of tactical suspicion, the investigators launched a discreet, multi-week surveillance operation targeting the administrative finances of the engineering firm. They eventually uncovered a secret off-the-books financial ledger detailing a succession of contract payments made directly to a local independent mortician named H.C. White. The entries revealed an administrative reality that completely destroyed the company's public defense. The mortician was being paid a flat, per-head rate of just $25 to secretly transport the bodies of the deceased African-American laborers out of the migrant camps under the absolute cover of midnight, utilizing unmarked flatbed trucks to dump the remains into hasty, uncoffined mass graves dug across abandoned cornfields and old plantation sites, ensuring that the true volume of the industrial slaughter remained completely hidden from state and federal inspectors. With this breakthrough, the true mind-bending geometry of the Hawks Nest Tunnel tragedy was officially entered into the historical record, allowing modern researchers to completely reconstruct the sequence of the crime from a terrifying forensic perspective. The over 700 men who officially perished during the excavation had not been taken by an atypical strain of pneumonia or an unpreventable natural virus. They had fallen victim to an intentional, corporate execution protocol designed to prioritize raw silicon extraction over human biology. When the laborers were forced to dry drill through the 99% pure quartz vein, every single inhalation drew millions of microscopic, razor-sharp particles of silica dust directly into the deepest regions of their respiratory tracts. These microscopic shards possessed a physical hardness that completely outmatched human tissue. Once inside the pulmonary alveoli, the glass fragments could not be cleared by the body's natural cellular defenses. Instead, they acted as millions of permanent internal scalpels, continuously lacerating the delicate blood vessels and air sacs with every single breath. The true forensic anomaly lay within the body's own immunological response to this internal trauma. To protect the surrounding organs from the continuous tearing of the quartz shards, the workers' immune systems rapidly generated a dense, highly aggressive matrix of thick scar tissue, a condition modernly classified as acute accelerated silicosis. The internal reaction was so exceptionally rapid and concentrated due to the volume of dust inside the unventilated mountain that the soft, pliable lung tissue was systematically calcified and petrified into solid stone while the men were still actively drawing breath. The mountain had never suffered a physical collapse. Instead, the corporation had deliberately and with complete calculation used the lungs of thousands of living men as industrial filters, physically transforming their internal organs into solid blocks of silica glass to maximize the production efficiency of their steel mills. The aftermath of the disaster left a permanent, dark scar on the history of American industrial regulation. Following a series of highly volatile congressional hearings in 1936, where the true scope of the mass graves was finally brought to light, Union Carbide utilized its massive political influence and high-leverage legal teams to escape severe criminal prosecution, settling the entire matter through a succession of small, out-of-court financial compensation structures that granted the surviving crippled workers just a few $100s each before the files were permanently archived. The total mortality projection for the project remains an open, haunting historical ledger, with conservative numbers asserting at least 764 fatalities, while independent epidemiological researchers estimate that over 1,000 men ultimately succumbed to the lung petrification within a few years of the tunnel's completion. The dark mouth of the Hawk's Nest Tunnel remains operational to this day, channeling the waters of the New River through the center of Gauley Mountain in absolute silence, a cold, stone reminder of the phantoms who left their breaths buried deep within the West Virginia clay. The historical case data, forensic path biological reconstructions, and administrative legal records presented across this program are compiled strictly from validated municipal archives, open-source historical research repositories, and contemporary epidemiological datasets. The anatomical descriptions, toxicological timelines, and spatial modeling of environmental contamination events are intended exclusively for educational, historical, and investigative analysis. They do not constitute formal medical evaluation, diagnostic criteria, or binding legal testimony regarding corporate or civil liability. All structural models of early 20th century industrial accidents are archived under international fair use data protocols, and any modern cross-referencing with active judicial or medical datasets must navigate proper administrative channels to preserve the confidentiality of historical census data.